Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to identify a Holley style or 4150 style carburetor. Even if you don't have any information on how to identify it, I'll give you guys a couple key tips that you're going to need in order to figure out what size carburetor you have. So on a bunch of the street carburetors, you'll have a choke horn assembly right here on the primary side. This particular main body is a 2-barrel main body, but if you can imagine that this is just half of a 4-barrel, then this right here would be the primary side and your choke horn would be right here. The choke horn is actually very important, but not necessarily because it operates the choke assembly, but back in the day they used to stamp the entire DNA of this carburetor right here in this top right corner. You guys can barely see what it is. You used to be able to take these numbers and look them up in a book and then later the internet, and it would give you pretty much all the specs on this carburetor. The problem comes later when we had race car drivers or people that were trying to pull a little bit more performance out of their carburetors that would actually cut the choke horn out, and when you do that you end up with something like this. Now, I did not cut this choke horn assembly off myself. This is actually a race series main body by Proform. They are built without a choke horn assembly, and lucky for us, Proform stamps the size of the carburetor right here on the side, and they stamp it right on top of the fuel bowl so you know exactly what size carburetor you're working on, even if you have it apart. Now let's say down the road somebody takes this carburetor apart, pulls these stickers off, and then intends to rebuild it in the future, but then they end up not doing so and the carburetor sits in a box for a couple years. Somebody else sees it at a swap meet and then tries to buy it, but then he doesn't know what kind of main body this is. If you call up Proform, they will actually send you the correct stickers in the main body, but that does you no good if you actually don't know the size of the carburetor itself. So there are 2, maybe even 3 key points that you want to look at in order to identify the size of the carburetor. And the easiest one to identify is actually underneath. What I've got here is a base plate to a 4-barrel 4150 style carburetor, but as you guys can see, there are no numbers anywhere on the base plate. So how are you supposed to identify what this base plate is supposed to belong to? The most obvious part is actually the bores of the throttle blades. If we were to take a measurement of these throttle bores, they would measure out at about 1 inch and 11/16, which is pretty much the standard throttle bore size if your carburetor is a 625, a 650, a 670, a 700, a 750, and a 780. Looking at this broken base plate that I have here on the left, you're going to be able to tell that these throttle bores are smaller than these throttle bores. So this throttle bore, if you measure it out, I can't really remember off the top of my head what the size is supposed to be, but going by eye, this looks to be a base plate for a 600 CFM carburetor. Now that you guys can identify the base plate, let's move on to the main body. The main body is going to be a little bit more tricky, but it's not too difficult. Let me go ahead and pull off the base plate so I can show you guys all the little details. Now that I went ahead and pulled off the base plate, I've got the bare main body right here. So like I mentioned before, we're going to take a look at the throttle bores, and the throttle bores are right here. They should match up perfectly to the base plate that you're working with. Just like we identified in the other base plate, if you go ahead and measure the inside bores of this carburetor, this will give you an idea of what base plate should be on it. So now that we've identified the size, what is the next key thing that we have to look at in order to pinpoint exactly what we're looking at? The next thing is going to be something that's not as obvious, but once you have 2 of them side by side, it's fairly apparent, and that is the size of the venturi that goes around the booster right here. This hole right here is not the same size and will not be the same size as the hole down here. The size of the venturi is always going to be smaller than the throttle bore size on a carburetor. The way the vacuum signal works on a carburetor is that air gets squeezed in between here and then it's released when it reaches down here, and that's what allows fuel to get pulled through the boosters. If you go in and you port out this area right here to match this area right here, you will lose all of your vacuum signal going to your boosters, and then your carburetor is just basically useless after that. It's a little hard to see, but you can kind of tell on this 2-barrel that the venturi on this 2-barrel is way smaller than the venturi in this carburetor on my right. Since the boosters are almost always in the way that I measure out the venturi is actually by using a socket. I'll find one that matches really close to the size of the venturi. So for example, this one that I have right here, if I go ahead and slide this in, it's just a hair loose than the size of the venturi, but then if I go ahead and try to fit it in the 2-barrel, it actually gets stuck halfway down. So I know that this size is bigger than that size. The nice part about this is that if you can get a socket that fits really close to the inside of this venturi, you can measure out the outside diameter of the socket, and that'll give you a pretty close estimate of the size of the venturi. Lucky for us, the differences in Venturi isn't a couple thousandths, it's usually 100 thousandths or more, and that gives you a sort of range to look for as you're identifying these carburetors. Like I mentioned before, this main body is a 750 CFM main body, but if we look right here, you can see that it's got down leg boosters. Down leg boosters actually flow just a hair more than straight leg boosters because it moves the booster deeper into the Venturi and out of the way of the air. So in reality, some can argue that this main body isn't actually a 750, it's actually a 780. The 650 CFM main body has the same throttle bores like we mentioned before, but the Venturi is actually smaller. The same way you can tell a 750 from a 780 is the same way that you'd be able to tell a 650 from a 625 or a 670 or a 600 or even a 575. The difference between a 600 and a 650 is the size of the throttle bores. The difference between a 650 and a 750 is the size of the Venturi. So going by that same logic, this actually has a smaller Venturi than this, but the throttle bores are actually the same size. So now we've identified that this is a 650 main body, and we've identified that this is a 750 main body. But just like this is actually closer to 780, the same thing can be said for this. Now, the size of these boosters, you guys can tell that they're much larger than the boosters that we had in the Proform main body. And that's because they're a completely different type of booster entirely. Whereas the 2-barrel that we were looking at has straight leg boosters, the 750 has down leg boosters, which is like a straight leg booster, but it's angled downward. This one actually has annular boosters, which most people say that these take up the most amount of space and actually drop the CFM the most. People estimate that you actually lose about 25 CFM per hole per booster. So for example, I had a 650 main body, and that main body had down leg boosters in the front, annular boosters in the rear. Because the annular boosters add CFM, it would make it a 670. But because you lose about 25 CFM per annular booster, that main body would actually be a 625. In the case that we have right here, we have annular boosters both front and rear. If this was a 650 main body, going by 25, 50, 75, 100, this would actually be a 550 CFM main body, otherwise known as a 575. A lot of things can change the actual CFM of a carburetor. Even things like the shape of the entry that leads into the Venturi can also make changes to the CFM rating. But now that you guys know what to look for, next time you guys see a main body with the missing choke horn, you guys will at least be able to identify it. So that's about it. Feel free to leave me some questions in the comments down below. I will see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher, signing out.